Lady, fairest lady. Ah, suffer your slave to fall at your feet with his thanks. No thanks are due, sir. I knew not who had fallen. Cruel coyness! Take not away the joy that has fed a hungry heart. Lord Glenisky's heart was wont to hunger for better joys. Lady, I have ceased to be a foolish boy. Such foolishness was better than some men's wisdom. Listen, belle demoiselle. I have been forth into the world, and have learned to see that monasteries have become mere haunts for the sluggard, who will not face the world, and that honor, glory, and all that is worth living for, lie beyond. Ah, lady! Those eyes first taught me what life could give. Hush, sir, said Esclarmonde. I can believe that as a child you mistook your vocation, and the secular life may be blessed to you, but with me it can never be so, and if any friendship were shown to you on my part, it was when I deemed that we were brother and sister in our vows. If I unwittingly inspired any false hopes, I must do penance for the evil. Call it not evil, lady, entreated Malcolm. It cannot be evil to have wakened me to life and hope and glory. What should you call it in him who should endeavour to render Lady Joan Beaufort faithless to your king, Lord Malcolm? What then must it be to tempt another to break troth-plight to the King of Heaven? Nay, madam, faltered Malcolm, but if such troth were forbidden and impossible? None has the right or power to cancel mine, replied the lady. Yet, he still entreated, your kindred are mighty. But my bridegroom is mightier, she said. O lady, yet, say, at least, cried Malcolm eagerly, that were you free in your own mind to wed, at least you would less turn from me than from the others proposed to you. That were saying little for you, said Esclarmonde, half smiling. But, sir, she added gravely, you have no right to put the question, and I will say nothing on which you can presume. You were kinder to me in England, sighed Malcolm, with tears in his eyes. Then you seemed as one like-minded, she answered. And, he cried, gathering fresh ardor, I would be like-minded again. You would render me so, sweetest lady. I would kiss your every step, pray with you, bestow alms with you, found churches, endow your beggings, and render our change from our childish purpose a blessing to the whole world, become your very slave, to do your slightest bidding. O lady, could I but give you my eyes to see what it might be? It could not be, if we began with the burthened conscience, said Esclarmonde. We have had enough of this, Sieur de Glenisky. You know that with me it is no matter of likes or dislikes, but that I am under a vow, which I will never break. Make way, sir. He could but obey, she was far too majestic and authoritative to be gainsaid. And Malcolm, in an access of misery, stood lost to all the world, kneeling in the window-seat, where she had left him resting his head against the glass, when suddenly a white plump hand was laid on his shoulder, and a gay voice cried, All à la mort, my young damoiseau. What, has our saint been unpropitious? Never mind, you shall have her yet. We will see her like the rest of the world, ere we have done within her. And Malcolm found himself face to face with the free-spoken Jacqueline of Hainaut. You are very good, madam, he stammered. You shall think me very good yet. I have no notion of being opposed by a little vassal of mine, and will succeed, if it were but for the fun of the thing. Monseigneur de Thérouenne is on your side, or would be, if he were sure of the Duke of Burgundy. You see, these prelates hate nothing so much as the religious orders, and all the pride of the Luxembourgs is in arms against Clairette's fancy for those beggarly nursing sisters, so it drives him mad to hear her say she only succored you for charity. He thinks it a family disgrace, that can only be wiped off by marrying her to you, and he would do it bon giari, mal giari, but that he waits to hear what Burgundy will say. You have only to hold out, and she shall be yours, if I hold her finger while you put on the ring. Only let us be sure of Burgundy." This was not a very flattering way of obtaining a bride, but Malcolm was convinced that when once married to Esclarmonde, his devotion would atone to her for all that was unpleasant in obtaining her. At least, she loved no one else. She had even allowed that she had once thought him like-minded. She had formerly distinguished him, and nothing lay between them but her scruples, and when they were overcome, by whatever means, his idol would be his, to adore, to propitiate, to win by the most intense devotion. All now must, however, turn upon the Duke of Burgundy, without whose sanction Madame of Hainaut would be afraid to act openly. The Duke was expected at Paris for the Whitsuntide festival, which was to be held with great state. The custom was for the kings of France to feast absolutely with all Paris, with interminable banquet tables, open to the whole world without question. And to this Henry had conformed on his first visit to the city, but he had learnt that the costly and lavish feast had been of very little benefit to the really distressed, who had been thrust aside by loud-voiced miscreants and sturdy beggars, such as had no shame in driving the feeble back with blows, and receiving their own share again and again. By the advice of Dr. Bennet, his almoner, he was resolved that this should not happen again, that the feast should be limited to the official guests, and that the cost of the promiscuous banquet should be distributed to those who really needed it, and who should be reached through their parish priests and the friars known to be most charitable. Dr. Bennet, as almoner, with the other chaplains, was to arrange the matter, and horrible was the distress that he discovered in the city, that had for 25 years been devastated by civil fury, as well as by foreign wars, and famines, pestilences, murders, and tyrannies had held sway, so as to form an absolute succession of reigns of terror. The poor perished like flies in a frost. The homeless orphans of the parents murdered by either faction roamed the streets, and herded in the corners like the vagrant dogs of eastern cities, and meantime, the nobles and their partisans revelled in wasteful pomp. Scholar as he was, Dr. Bennet was not familiar enough with Parisian ways not to be very grateful for aid from Esclarmonde in some of his conferences, and for her explanations of the different tastes and needs of French and English poor. What she saw and heard, on the other hand, gave form and purpose to her aspirations. The Dutch sisters of St. Bega, the English beadswomen of St. Catherine, were sorely needed at Paris. They would gather up the sufferers, collect the outcast children, feed the hungry, follow with balm wherever a wound had been. To found a beguinage at Paris seemed to her the most befitting mode of devoting her wealth, and her little admirer, Alice, gave up her longing desire that the foundation should be in England, when she learned that, as the wife of Neville, her abode was likely to be in France as long as that country required English garrisons. To the young heiress of Salisbury, her own marriage, though close at hand, seemed a mere ordinary matter compared with Esclarmonde's beguinage, to her the real romance. Never did she see a beggar crouching at the church door, without a whisper to herself that there was a subject for the beggings, and, tender-hearted as she was, she looked quite gratified at any lamentable tale which told the need. If Esclarmonde had a climax to her visions of her brown-robed messengers of mercy, it was that the holy canon of St. Agnes should be induced to come and act the part of master to her beadswomen, as did Master Kedbesby at home. She had even dared to murmur her design to Dr. Bennet, and when he, under strict seal of secrecy, had sounded King Henry, the present real master of Paris, he reported that the tears had stood in the king's eyes for a moment, as he said, "Blessings on the maiden. Should she be able to do this for this city, I shall know that heaven hath indeed sent a blessing by my arms." For one brief week, Esclarmonde and Alice were very happy in this secret hope, but at the end of that time the Bishop of Therouenne appeared. Esclarmonde had ventured to hope that the king's influence, and likewise the fact that her intention was not to enrich one of the regular monastic orders, might lead him to lend a favorable ear to her scheme, but she was by no means prepared to find him already informed of the affair of the Dance of Death, and putting his own construction on it. "So, my fair cousin, this is the end of your waywardness. The tokens were certainly somewhat strong, but the young gentleman's birth being equal to yours, after the spectacle you have presented, your uncle of St. Pol, and I myself, must do our utmost to obtain the consent of the Duke of Burgundy." Monseigneur is mistaken, said Esclairmonde. Child, we will have no more folly. You have flown after this young Scot in a manner fitted only for the foolish name your father culled for you out of his books of chivalry. You have given a lesson to the whole court and city on the consequences of a damsel judging for herself, and running a mad course over the world, instead of submitting to her guardians. The court understands my purpose as well as you do, Monseigneur. Silence, mademoiselle. Your convent obstinacy is ended forever now, since to send you to one would be to appear to hide a scandal. I do not wish to enter a convent, said Esclairmonde. My desire is to dedicate my labor and my substance to the foundation of a house here at Paris, such as are the beguinages of our Netherlands. The bishop held up his hands. He had never heard of such lunacy, and it angered him, as such purposes are wont to anger worldly-hearted men. That a lady of Luxembourg should have such vulgar tastes as to wish to be a beguine was bad enough, but that Netherlandish wealth should be devoted to support the factious poor of Paris was preposterous. Neither the Duke of Burgundy nor her uncle of St. Pol would allow a so to pass out of their grasp for so absurd a purpose. The Pope would give no license, above all to a vain girl who had helped a wife to run away from her husband for new religious houses, and, unless Esclairmonde was prepared to be landless, penniless, and the scorn of every one, for her wild behavior, she must submit, bongiare, malgiare, to become the wife of the Scottish prince. Landless and penniless then will I be, Monseigneur, said Esclairmonde. Was not poverty the bride of Saint Francis? The bishop made a growl of contempt, but recollecting himself, and his respect for the saint, began to argue that what was possible for a man, a mere merchant's son, an inspired saint besides, was not possible to a damsel of high degree, and that it was mere presumption, vanity, and obstinacy in her to appeal to such a precedent. There was something in this that struck Esclairmonde, for she was conscious of a certain satisfaction in her plan of being the first to introduce a beguinage at Paris, and that she was to a certain degree proud of her years of constancy to her high purpose, and she looked just so far abashed that the uncle saw his advantage, and discoursed on the danger of attempting to be better than other people, and of trying to vapor in spiritual heights, to all of which she attempted no reply, till at last he broke up the interview by saying, "There, then, child, all will be well. I see you are coming to a better mind." "I hope I am, Monseigneur," she replied, with lofty meekness, "but scarcely such as you mean." Alice Montague's indignation knew no bounds. What? Was this noble votaress to be forced, not only to resign the glory of being the foundress of a new order of beneficence, but to be married, just like everybody else, and to that wretched little coward? Beaumont of Burgundy was better than that, for he at least was a man. "No, no, Alice," said Esclairmonde, with a shudder, "anyone rather than the Burgundian. It is shame even to compare the Scot." "He may not be so evil in himself," said Alice, "but with a brave man you have only his own sins, while a coward has all those other people may frighten him into." "He bore himself manfully in battle," said the fair Fleming in reproof. But Alice answered with the scorn that sits so quaintly on the gentle daughter of a bold race, "Aye, or he would have been more afraid to run than to stand." "You are hard on the Scot," said Esclairmonde. "Maybe it is because the Nevilles of Raby are borderers," she added, smiling, and, as Alice likewise smiled and blushed, "now, if it were not for this madness, I could like the youth. I would fain have had him for a brother that I could take care of." "But what will you do, Esclairmonde?" "Trust," said she, sighing. "Maybe, my pride ought to be broken, and I may have to lay aside all my hopes and plans, and become a mere serving sister, to learn true humility. Anyhow, I verily trust to my heavenly spouse to guard me for himself. If the Duke of Burgundy still maintains Beaumont's suit, then in the dissension I see an escape. And my father will defend you, and so will Sir Richard," said Alice, with complacent certainty in their full efficiency. "And King Harry will interfere, and we will have your hospital. Aye, we will. How can you talk so lightly of abandoning it? I only would know what is human pride, and what God's will, sighed Esclairmont. The Duke arrived with his two sisters, his wife being left at home in bad health, and took up his abode at the Hotel de Bourgogne, whence he came at once to pay his respects to the King of England, the poor King of France, at the Hotel de Saint-Pol, being quite neglected. Esclairmont and Alice stood at a window, and watched the arrival of the magnificent cavalcade, attended by a multitude, ecstatically shouting, Noel, Noel! Long live Philippe le Bon! Blessings on the mighty Duke! While seated on a tall charger, whose great dappled head, jeweled and beplumed, could alone be seen amid his sweeping housings, bowing right and left, waving his embroidered gloved hand in courtesy, was seen the stately Duke, in the prime of life, handsome-faced, brilliantly colored, dazzlingly arrayed in gemmed robes, so that Alice drew a long breath of wonder and exclaimed, "This Duke is a goodly man, he looks like the Emperor of us all." But when he had entered the hall, conducted by John of Bedford and Edmund of March, had made his obeisance to Henry, and had been presented by him to King James, Alice, standing close behind her queen, recollected that she had once heard Esclairmont say, "Till I came to England I deemed chivalry a mere gaudy illusion." Duke Philippe would not bear close inspection. The striking features and full red lips, that had made so effective an appearance in the gay procession seen from a distance, seemed harsh, haughty, and sensual near at hand, and when brought into close contact with the strange bright stern purity, now refined into hectic transparency, of King Henry's face, the grand and melancholy majesty of the royal stewards, or even the spare, keen, irregular visage of John of Bedford. And while his robes were infinitely more costly than, and his ornaments tenfold outnumbered, all that the three island princes wore, yet no critical eye could take him for their superior, even though his tone in addressing an inferior was elaborately affable and condescending, and theirs was always the frankness of an equal. Where they gave the sense of pure gold, he seemed like some ruder metal gilt and decorated, as if theirs were reality, his the imitation, theirs the truth, his the display. But in reality his birth was as princely as theirs, and no monarch in Europe, not even Henry, equaled him in material resources. He was idolized by the Parisians, and Henry was aware that France had been made over to England more by his revenge for his father's murder at Montereau than by the victory at Agincourt. Therefore the king endured his grand talk about our arms and our intentions, and for Malcolm's sake, James submitted to a sort of patronage, as if meant to imply that if Philippe the Magnificent chose to espouse the cause of a captive king, his ransom would be the merest trifle. When Henry bade him to the Pentecostal banquet, when kings keep state, he graciously accepted the invitation for himself and his two sisters, Marguerite, widow of the second short-lived Dauphin, and Anne, still unmarried. But when Henry further explained his plan of feasting merely with the orderly, and apportioning the food in real alms, the Duke by no means approved. "Feed those miserables," he said. "One gains nothing thereby. They make no noise, whereas if you affront the others, who know how to cry out, they will revile you like dogs." "I will not be a slave to the rascal," said Henry. "Ah, my fair lord, you, a victor, may dispense with these cares, but for a poor little prince like me, it is better to reign in men's hearts than on their necks." "In the hearts of honest men, on the necks of knaves," said Henry. Philippe shrugged his shoulders. He was wise in his own generation, for he had all the audible voices in Paris on his side, while the cavils at Henry's economy have descended to the present time. "Do you see your rival, sir?" said the voice of the Bishop of Therouanne in Malcolm's ear, just as the Duke had begun to rise to take leave, and he pointed out a knight of some 30 years, glittering with gay devices from head to foot, and showing a bold proud visage, exaggerating the harshness of the Burgundian lineaments. Malcolm shuddered, and murmured, "Such a pearl to such a hog." And meanwhile, King James, stepping forward, intimated to the Duke that he would be glad of an interview with him. Philippe made some ostentation of his numerous engagements with men of church and state, but ended by inviting the King of Scotland to sup with him that evening, if his grace would forgive traveller's fare and a simple reception. Thither accordingly James repaired on foot, attended only by Sir Nigel and Malcolm, with a few archers of the royal guard, in case torches should be wanted on the way home. How magnificent were the surroundings of the great Duke, it would be wearisome to tell. The retainers in the court of the hotel looked, as James said, as if honest steel and good cloth were reckoned as churls, and as if this were the very land of Cockaigne, as Sir Richard Whittington had dreamed it. Neither he nor St. Andrew himself would know their own saltire made in cloth of silver, the very metal to tarnish. Sir Nigel had to tell their rank, ere the porters admitted the small company, but the seneschal marshalled them forward in full state. And James never looked more the king than when, in simple crimson robe, the pure white cross on his breast, his auburn hair parted back from his noble brow, he stood towering above all heads, passively receiving the Duke of Burgundy's elaborate courtesies and greetings, nor seeming to note the lavish display of gold and silver, meant to amaze the poorest king in Europe. Exceeding was the politeness shown to him, even to the omission of the seneschals tasting each dish presented to the Duke, a recognition of the presence of a sovereign that the two Scots scarcely understood enough for gratitude. Malcolm was the best off of the two at the supper, for James had of course to be cavalier to the sickly fretful-looking Dauphiness, while Malcolm fell to the lot of the Lady Anne, who, though not beautiful, had a kindly hearty countenance and manner, and won his heart by asking whether the Demoiselle de Luxembourg were still in the suite of Madame of Hainaut, and then it appeared that she had been her convent mate and warmest friend and admirer in their girlish days at Dijon, and was now longing to see her. Was she as much set as ever on being a nun? Meantime, the Duke was pompously making way for the King of Scots to enter his cabinet, where, with a gold cup before each, a dish of comfits and a stoup of wine between them, their interview was to take place. "These dainties accord with a matter of ladies' love," said James, as the Duke handed him a sugar heart transfixed by an arrow. "Good, good," said Philippe. "The alliance is noble, and our crowns and influence might be a good check in the north to your mighty neighbor, nor would I be hard as to her dowry. Send me 50 yearly of such knaves as came with Buchan, and I could fight the devil himself. A morning gift might be specified for the name of the thing, but we understand one another." "I am not certain of that, sir," said James, smiling, "though I see you mean me kindly." "Nay, now," continued Philippe, "I know how to honor royalty, even endurance, nor will I even press Madame la Dauphine on you instead of an, though it were better for us all if she could have her wish and become a queen, and you would have her jointure if you or anyone else can get it." "Stay, my Lord Duke," said James, with dignity, "I spake not of myself, deeming that it was well known that my troth is plighted." "How?" said Burgundy, amazed, but not offended. "Methought the house of Somerset was a mere bastard slip, with which even King Henry with all his insolence could not expect you to wed in earnest. However, we may keep our intentions secret a while, and then, with your lances and my resources, English displeasure need concern you little." James, who had learned self-control in captivity, began politely to express himself highly honored and obliged. "Do not mention it. Royal blood, thus shamefully oppressed, must command the aid of all that is chivalrous. Speak, and your ransom is at your service." The hot blood rushed into James's cheek at this tone of condescension, but he answered, with courteous haughtiness, "Of myself, Sir Duke, there is no question. My ransom waits England's willingness to accept it, and my hand is not free, even for the prize you have the goodness to offer. I came not to speak of myself. Not to make suit for my sister, nor my intercession," exclaimed Philippe. "I make suit to no man," said James, then, recollecting himself, "if I did so, no readier friend than the Duke of Burgundy could be found. I did in effect come to propose an alliance between one of my own house and a fair vassal of yours." "Ha! The runaway jade of Luxembourg," cried Burgundy, "the most headstrong girl who lives. She dared to plead her foolish vows against my brother Beaumont, fled with that other hoyden of Hainaut, and now defies me by coming here. I'll have her, and make her over to Beaumont to tame her pride, were she in the great Satan's camp instead of King Henry's? And this is the mirror of chivalry, thought James. But he persevered in his explanation of his arrangement for permitting the estates of Esclairmont de Luxembourg to be purchased from her and her husband, should that husband be Malcolm Stewart of Glenisky, and he soon found that these terms would be as acceptable to the Duke as they had already proved to her guardian, Monseigneur de Thérouenne. Money was nothing to Philippe, but his policy was to absorb the little seigneurialties that lay so thick in these borderlands of the empire, and what he desired above all, was to keep them from either passing into the hands of the Church, or from consolidating into some powerful principality, as would have been the case had Esclairmont either entered a convent or married young Walleran de Luxembourg, her cousin. Therefore he had striven to force on her his half-brother, who would certainly never unite any inheritance to hers, but he much preferred the purchase of her Hainaut lands, and had no compunction in throwing over Beaumont, except for a certain lurking desire that the lady's contumacy should be chastised by a lord who would beat her well into subjection. He would willingly have made a great show of generosity, and have laid James under an obligation, and yet by the king's dignified tone of courtesy he was always reduced to the air of one soliciting rather than conferring a favor. Finally, Malcolm was called in, and presented to the Duke, making his own promise on his word of honor as a prince, and giving a written bond, that so soon as he obtained the hand of the Demoiselle de Luxembourg he would resign her Hainaut estates to the Duke of Burgundy for a sum of money, to be fixed by persons chosen for the purpose. This was more like earnest than anything Malcolm had yet obtained, and he went home exulting and exalted, his doubts as to Esclairmont's consent almost silenced, when he counted up the forces that were about to bear upon her. And they did descend upon her. Countess Jacqueline had been joined by other and more congenial Flemish dames, and was weary of her grave monitress, and she continually scolded at Esclairmont for perverseness and obstinacy in not accepting the only male thing she had ever favored. The Bishop of Thérouenne threatened and argued, and the Duke of Burgundy himself came to enforce his commands to his refractory vassal, and on finding her still unsubmissive, flew into a rage, and rated her as few could have done, save Philippe, called the Good. All she attempted to answer was, that they were welcome to her lands, so they would leave her person free, her vows were not to man, but to God, and God would protect her. It was an answer that seemed specially to enrage her persecutors, who retorted by telling her that such protection was only extended to those who obeyed lawful authority, and hints were thrown out that, if she did not submit willingly, she might find herself married forcibly, for a bishop could afford to disregard the resistance of a bride. Would his king, consent to her being thus treated? As to Malcolm, he seemed to her too much changed for her to reckon on what remnant of good feeling there might be to appeal to in him. And James, though he was certain not to permit palpable coercion in his presence, or even if he were aware that it was contemplated, seemed to have left the whole management of the affair to Esclairmont's own guardians, and they would probably avoid driving matters to extremities that would revolt him, while he was near enough for an appeal. And Esclairmont was too uncertain whether her guardians would resort to such lengths, or whether it were not a vain threat of the giddy countess, to compromise her dignity by crying out before she was hurt, and she had no security, save that she was certain that in the English household of King Henry such violence would not be attempted, and out of reach of that protection she never ventured. Once she said to Henry, "My only hope is in God and in you, my lord." And Henry bent his head, saying, "Noble lady, I cannot interfere, but while you are in my house, nothing can be done with you against your will." Yet even Henry was scarcely what he had been in all-pervading vigilance and readiness. Like all real kings of men, he had been his own prime minister, commander-in-chief, and private secretary, transacting a marvelous amount of business with prompt completeness, and when, in the midst of shattered health which he would not avow, the cares of 2 kingdoms, and the generalship of an army, with all its garrisons, rested on him, his work would hardly have been accomplished but for his brother's aid. It was never acknowledged, often angrily disdained. But when John of Bedford had watched the terrible lassitude and lethargy that weighed on the king at times in the midst of his cabinet work, he was constantly on the watch to relieve him, and his hand and style so closely resembled Henry's that the difference could scarce be detected, and he could do what none other durst attempt. Many a time would Henry, whose temper had grown most uncertain, fiercely rate him for intermeddling, but John knew and loved him too well to heed, and his tact and unobtrusiveness made Henry rely on him more and more. If the illness had only been confessed, those who watched the king anxiously would have had more hope, but he was hotly angered at any hint of his needing care, and though he sometimes relieved oppression by causing himself to be bled by a servant, he never allowed that anything ailed him. It was always the hot weather, the anxious tidings, the long pageant that wearied him, things that were wont to be like gnats on a lion's mane. Those solemn banquets and festivals lasting from forenoon till eventide, with their endless relays of allegorical subtleties, their long-winded harangues, noisy music, interludes of giants, sylvan men, distressed damsels, knights errant on horseback, ships and forests coming in upon wheels, and fulsome compliments that must be answered, had been always his aversion, and were now so heavy an oppression that Bedford would have persuaded the Queen to curtail them. But to the fair Catherine this appeared an unkind endeavor of her disagreeable brother-in-law, to prevent her from shining in her native city, and eclipsing the Burgundian pomp, and she opened her soft brown eyes in dignified displeasure, answering that she saw nothing amiss with the king, and she likewise complained to her husband of his brother's jealousy of her welcome from her own people, bringing on him one of Henry's most bitter sentences. Henry would only have had her abate somewhat of the splendor that gratified her, because he did not think it becoming to outshine her parents, but Catherine scorned the notion. Her old father would know nothing, or would smile in his foolish way to see her so brave, and for her mother, she recked not so long as she had a larded capon before her, nor was it possible to make the young queen understand that this fatuity and feebleness were the very reasons for deferring to them. The ordering of the feast fell to Catherine and her train, and its splendors on successive days had their full development, greatly to the constraint and weariness, among others, of Esclaremont, who was always assigned to Malcolm Stuart, and throughout these long days had to be constantly repressing him, not that he often durst make her any direct compliment, for he was usually quelled into anxious wistful silence, and merely eyed her earnestly, paying her every attention in his power. And such a silent tedious meal was sure to be remarked either with laughing rudeness by Countess Jacqueline, or with severe reproof by the Bishop of Therouenne, both of whom assured her that she had better lay aside her airs, and resign herself in good part, for there was no escape for her. One day, however, when the feast was at the Hôtel de Bourgogne, and there were some slight differences in the order of the guests, the Duke of Bedford put himself forward as the Lady Esclaremont's cavalier, so much to her relief, that her countenance, usually so guarded, relaxed into the bright, sweet smile of cheerfulness that was most natural to her. Isolated as the pairs at the table were, and with music braying in a gallery just above, there was plenty of scope for conversation, and once again Esclaremont was talking freely of the matters regarding the distress in Paris, that Bedford had consulted her upon before he became so engrossed with his brother's affairs, or she so beset by her persecutors. Towards the evening, when the feast had still some mortal hours to last, there fell a silence on the Duke, and at length, when the music was at the loudest, he said, "Lady, I have watched for this moment. You are persecuted. Look not on me as one of your persecutors, but if no other refuge be open to you, here is one who might know better how to esteem you than that malapert young Scot." "How, sir?" exclaimed Esclaremont, amazed at these words from the woman-hating Bedford. "Make no sudden reply," said John. "I had never thought of you save as one consecrate, till, when I see you like to be hunted down into the hands of yon silly lad, I cannot but thrust between. My brother would willingly consent, and, if I may but win your leave to love you, lady, it will be with a heart that is yearned to no other woman." He spoke low and steadily, looking straight before him, with no visible emotion, save a little quiver in the last sentence, a slight dilating of the delicately cut nostril, and then he was silent, until, having recovered the self-restraint that had been failing him, he prevented the words she was trying to form by saying, "Not in haste, lady. There is time yet before you to bethink yourself whether you can be free in will and conscience. If so, I will bear you through all." How invitingly the words fell on the lonely heart, so long left to fight its own battles. There came for the first time the full sense of what life might be, the shielding tenderness, the sure reliance, the pure affection, such as she saw Henry lavish on the shallow queen, but which she could meet and requite in John. The brutal Beaumont, the childish Malcolm, had aroused no feeling in her but dislike or pity, and to them a convent was infinitely preferable. But Bedford, the religious, manly, brave, unselfish Bedford, opened to her the view of all that could content a high-souled woman's heart, backed, moreover, by the wonder of having been the first to touch such a spirit. It would not have been a mésalliance. Her family was one of the grandest of the Netherlands. The saintly Emperor, Henry of Luxembourg, was her ancestor, and Bedford's proposal was not a condescension such as to rouse her sense of dignity. His rank did not strike her as did his lofty stainless character, the like of which she had never known to exist in the world of active life till she saw the Brothers of England, who came more near to the armed saints and holy warriors of church legend than her fancy had thought mortal man could do, bred as she had been in the sensual, violent, and glittering Burgundy of the 15th century. In truth, as Malcolm had thought the cloister the only refuge from the harshness and barbarism of Scotland, so Esclairmont had thought piety and purity to be found nowhere else, and both had found the court of Henry V an infinitely better world than they had supposed possible. But, until the present moment, Esclairmont had never felt the slightest call to take a permanent place there. Now, however, the cloister, even if it were open to her, presented a gloomy, cheerless life of austerity, in comparison with human affection and matronly duty. And most vivid of all at the moment was the desire to awaken the tender sweetness that slept in those steady grey eyes, to see the grave, wise visage gleam with smiling affection, and to rest in having one to take thought for her, and finish this long term of tossing about in self-defense. Was not the patience with which he kept his eyes away from her already a proof of his consideration and delicate kindness? But deep in Esclairmont's soul lay the sense that her dedication was sacred, and her power over herself gone. She had always felt a wife's allegiance due to him whom she received as her spiritual spouse, and though the sense at this moment only brought her disappointment and self-reproach, her will was loyal. The bond was cutting into her very flesh, but she never even thought of breaking it, and all she waited for was the power of restraining her grateful tears. In this she was assisted by observing that Bedford's attention had been attracted towards his brother, who was looking wan and weary, scarcely tasting what was set before him, and, after fitfully trying to converse with Marguerite of Burgundy, at last had taken advantage of an endless harangue from all the virtues, and had dropped asleep. The lady was seen making a sign to her sister not to disturb him, and Bedford murmured, with a sigh, "There is, for once, a discreet woman." Then, as if recalled to a sense of what was passing, he turned on Esclairmont his full earnest look, saying, "You will teach the Queen how he should be cared for. You will help me." "Sir," said Esclairmont, feeling it most difficult not to falter, "this is a great grace, but it cannot be." "Cannot," said Bedford, slowly. "You have taken thought?" "Sir, it is not the part of a betrothed spouse to take thought. My vows were renewed of my own free will, and it were sacrilege to try to recall them for the first real temptation." She spoke steadily, but the effort ached through her whole frame, especially when the last word illumined John Plantagenet's face with strange sweet light, quenched as his lip trembled, his nostril quivered, his eye even moistened, as he said, "It is enough, lady, I will no more vex one who was vexed enough already, and you will so far trust me as to regard me as your protector, if you should be in need?" "Indeed I will," said Esclairmont, hardly restraining her tears. "That is well," said Bedford. And he neither looked at her nor spoke to her again, till, as he led her away in the procession from the hall, he held her hand fast, and murmured, "There then it rests, sweet lady, unless, having taken counsel with your own heart, you should change your decree, and consult some holy priest. If so, make but a sign of the hand, and I am yours, for verily you are the only maiden I could ever have loved." She was still in utter confusion, in the chamber where the ladies were cloaking for their return, when her hands were grasped on either side by the two Burgundian princesses. "Sweet runaway, we have caught you at last. Here, into Anne's chamber. See you we must. How is it with you?" "Like you the limping Scot better than Beaumont," laughed the Dauphiness, her company dignity laid aside for schoolgirl chatter. If you cannot hold out, said Anne, the Scot seems a gentle youth, and, at least, you are quit of Beaumont. Yes, said Marguerite, his last prank was too strong for the Duke, quartering a dozen men-at-arms on a sulky Cambrai weaver till he paid him 2,000 crowns. Besides, it would be well to get the Scottish king for an ally. Do you know what we two are here for, Clairette? We are both to be betrothed, one to the handsome captive with the gold locks, the other to your hawk-nosed neighbor, who seemed to have not a word to say. But, said Esclarmonde, replying to the easiest part of the disclosure, the King of Scots is in love with the Demoiselle of Somerset. What matters that, silly maid, said Marguerite, he does not displease me, and is welcome to that melancholy Duke. Oh, Lady Anne, exclaimed Esclarmonde, if such be your lot, it would be well indeed. What, the surly brother, of whom Catherine tells such tales, continued Marguerite. Credit them not, said Esclarmonde. He never crosses her but when he would open her eyes to his brother's failing health. Yes, interrupted Marguerite, my lord brother swears that this king will not live a year, and if Catherine have no better luck with her child than poor Michel, then there will be another good queen in England. If so, said Esclarmonde, looking at her friend with swimming eyes, she will have the best of husbands, as good as even she deserves. And held her hand fast, and would have said many tender words on Esclarmonde's own troubles, but the other ladies were arrayed, and Esclarmonde would not for worlds have been left behind in the Hôtel de Bourgogne. Privacy was not an attainable luxury, and Esclarmonde could not commune with her throbbing heart, or find peace for her aching head, till night. This must be a matter unconfided to any, even Alice Montague. And while the maiden lay smiling in her quiet sleep, after having fondly told her friend that Sir Richard Neville had really noticed her new silken kirtle, she knelt on beneath the crucifix, mechanically reciting her prayers, and, as the beads dropped from her fingers, fighting out the fight with her own heart. Her mind was made up, but her sense of the loss, her craving for the worthy affection which lay within her grasp, these dismayed her. The life she had sighed for had become a blank, and she passionately detested the obligation that held her back from affection, usefulness, joy, and excellence, not ambition, for the greatest help to her lay in Bedford's position, his exalted rank, and nearness to the crown. Indeed, she really dreaded and loathed worldly pomp so much that the temptation would have been greater had he not been a prince. It was this sense of renunciation that came to her aid. She had at least a real sacrifice to offer. Till now, as she became aware, she had made none. She folded her hands, and laid her offering to be hallowed by the one all-sufficient sacrifice. She offered all those capacities for love that had been newly revealed to her, she offered up the bliss, whose golden dawn she had seen, she tried to tear out the earthliness of her heart and affections by the roots, and lay them on the altar, entreating that, come what might, her spirit might never stray from the heavenly spouse of her betrothal. Therewith came a sense of his perfect sufficiency, of rest, peace, support, ineffable love, that kept her kneeling in a calm, almost ecstatic state, in which common hopes, fears, and affections had melted away.